I'm a wanderer when I talk, but
Tell the media guy on you if you move.
that's right. That's right. Get me in trouble. Let's see, Michael. What's the key manageable component of a soil that if you're a farmer you want to manage to promote soil health? Yes, you pass. You pass. Michael is the only student that he's now my interim research associate, but he was a student in my organic ag class a few semesters ago. And how many times do I say that in the course of a semester? Yeah, several. He's I think underestimating how many times I say that. Several times. And I say that just because, if you look at the title here, I called it Strategies and Practices for Building Soil Health on Modern Organic Farms. And that's what I do here at Kentucky State. I'm mostly thinking about best management practices for organic producers and helping producers. Like Keith recently got certified, so it's part of my job to answer questions about how to help producers understand the rules, or to direct them to technical service providers like Organic Association of Kentucky that helps with the transition training process. I'm not supposed to say transition training anymore. They've changed the name of the program. It's the Organic Transition Program at Organic Association of Kentucky. So,
and you also oversee its organic inspectors training.
Yeah, and we're doing things with organic inspectors training. I mean, yes, I'm glad to hear that, Keith. I'm glad to hear that. We can make that happen. November 2024 is when the trainings are going to be. I've got it on the book. So in fact, 2 weeks ago, I talked to Margaret Scholes at International Organic Inspectors Association, and so it's semi-tentative on the books, but it's on the books. It's on the books. We got a date, yeah. We don't know the exact date. Back to my point. I say organic farm on this, but I think that statement, the single most important thing that a farmer could manage to promote soil health, it's not necessarily on an organic farm. This is on organic, and I don't like to call them conventional. I think in terms of certification, so either you're certified or you're not, so you're either organic or non-organic. And you could be a not so good soil manager and be certified organic, and you could be a really good soil manager and be not certified organic. So I don't like to get into that organic versus conventional because people sort of have already implanted mental pictures of what it means to be organic or conventional, right? And there's really a wide range within both sets of producers or stakeholders. So having said all that, I have to get through 40 slides. I better not spend that much time on too many more slides that are just introductory slides. Anybody know where this is? Kutztown, Rodale Institute. So they're pretty well-known organic research institute. They do a lot of work promoting soil health in organic systems, and we've sort of been reintroduced to this idea of soil health within the last, say, 5-10 years. And I mean, by that I mean it's gone mainstream. I've been working on it for like 20 years, and so it's really cool now to see lots of people talking about soil carbon, right? And soil organic matter. People have been thinking about it for years without really acknowledging that they were thinking about what we now call soil health. And one of the folks that I don't think gets enough credit, and we're sitting at an 1890 land grant, which is a historically black college. We have Carver Hall right here on campus on the other side of the building that I work in, Atwood Hall, the Atwood Research Institute. Well, we have the George Washington Carver Hall. And Carver was way ahead of his time on soil health. And he doesn't often get acknowledged as one of the leading thinkers original thinkers about soil health, because he never really used the term, but the stuff that he was talking about was all soil health. So I like to just go through a little history with Carver and a few other folks that have been important in sort of helping us to think about what we now call soil health. Carver was at Tuskegee. Of course, he studied at Iowa State before he was at Tuskegee, but he was really an extension specialist at Tuskegee. And he had a portable lab that he would take with him and show, the farmers in his region, his stakeholders, the black farmers that he was working with, techniques that we now call sustainable agriculture. He was thinking about crop rotation. And this was by necessity, right? He recognized that the soils were being depleted, and if they're going to keep being farmed and being useful in terms of producing the things that humans want to get from them, we need to think about them differently. And so he was thinking about rotating legumes to fix nitrogen, peanuts, soybeans, cowpeas, and working them into crop rotations with things like pecans. Is it pecan or pecan? I don't know. I'm from the north, so I'm wrong either way, probably. Sweet potatoes, cotton was also an important component of some of the crop rotations that Carver was thinking about. That's his mobile lab. Pretty cool. He would go around and do demonstrations, and he brought the classes to the farmers. He, as I mentioned earlier, he was at Iowa State, and he met Henry A. Wallace Sr. and Henry A. Wallace Jr. So Jr. is probably the more famous of the two. Jr. ended up becoming vice president under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but before he was vice president under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Jr. also was the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, and he was really in his role when we were seeing the effects of the Dust Bowl, right? And he was involved in the cleanup after the Dust Bowl and involved in the establishment of the Soil Conservation Service, which is now the NRCS, because they recognized, oh crap, we have really messed up with how we're managing some of our soils, and we need to do things different, and we need to promote the idea of minimizing erosion and installing cover crops. But long before he was doing this, Henry A. Wallace was the son of Henry A. Wallace Sr., who was a professor at Iowa State, where George Washington Carver was studying, and Carver befriended Henry A. Wallace Jr., and he liked his dad too as a professor, but these guys would have agricultural conversations and talked about a lot of the things together that we now think of as soil health. It was actually Wallace that if we do a deep dive in history, Wallace first coined the term soil health, but he was talking about physical and chemical properties of soil, and he didn't really get into the biology. And more modern concepts of soil health really think a lot about the biology. And as we move forward and progress towards where we are now, people started thinking about the importance of the biology, the plants and animals, the bacteria, the molds, the interactions of all these things in the ecosystem, the relationships between soil health and human health, and I teach a lot of classes here where we talk about humans being embedded in the ecosystem. Like we're all sitting in a room and we're surrounded by 4 concrete walls, and we don't think about the fact that, we're dependent on the services that the water systems and the soil systems around us provide. And if we have healthier ecosystems around us, it stands to serve that we can have healthier people and healthier communities. Gene talked a little bit about compost and disease suppression, and the same things go into the idea of a healthy soil. If you have a healthy soil and a diverse microbial population in that soil, well, now those good guy microorganisms in the soil are able to outcompete some of the bad guys that might cause disease in your crops. And so and I don't know, did you get into the mechanisms a little bit? Did I miss that? Because I was back there multitasking a little bit. Yeah. I can't wait to see that. But you know, the idea there is if you have a healthier soil and a more biodiverse soil, then it's more resilient in terms of fending off some of these disease-causing microorganisms. And again, then, you know, moving forward in the 80s, people started talking about societal health. You know, they talked a little bit about human health in the 30s, but then going sort of wider range, talking about overall societal health, and thinking about, all right, manage our soils well, we manage our own health well, right? And this is what you get if you don't manage your soil well. I mentioned FDR earlier. Well, at one point, probably when he was looking at the effects of the Dust Bowl, he said, a nation that destroys its soils destroys itself. And this was one of the, I think he was first quoted saying this when he was in the process of establishing the Soil Conservation Service. Because again, they'd just gone through the Dust Bowl, and if you've seen the pictures of some of the things that happened in the Dust Bowl, let's see, where's my pointer? That's going to send me backwards. No, yeah, I think I saw something. There is a pointer, but I don't see it. That bottom left, what's that? Yeah, the bottom left is, you know, I'm not sure exactly where that is, but that's a pretty typical scene during the Dust Bowl where you have a massive dust cloud rolling across the plains. And I've heard anecdotal stories that some of these dust clouds got as far east as Washington, D.C., and the white buildings in our capital were tan instead of white because of dust traveling from the Great Plains. If you mismanage the soil long enough, you can get what we call crusting. That's an example of crusting up in the top right. And that's where your soil structure has been so degraded that you really don't have structure. You just have these little chunks of soil that kind of stick together in unfortunate ways if you're a plant. Because if we look at this picture, you know, the only places plants are coming up are in between the cracks in this crust. And so that's not really conducive to good crop production. We don't see this as much anymore. I think more and more people are getting into cover crops and understanding cover crops, but that's erosion in a field on the bottom right there. And it kind of looks like it might be somewhere in Ohio or Iowa, you know, one of those big flat states. I have to drive through Ohio when I go home to visit my parents in Pennsylvania, and there's just big expanses that look like this with a little cute white barn in the middle. But that's erosion. You can see the rills. Where the water has been carrying soil. We want the soil to stay here. We don't want it in our rivers, and we don't want to end up being sediments downstream, but this is what happens when you leave a soil uncovered. You ever see an uncovered soil in nature? No. And so, you know, we've learned now that we need to keep our soils covered. So as we've moved forward and we've started thinking about, well, what does soil health mean? When I was a graduate student at University of Maryland, we were using the term soil quality. And this was the late 90s, early 2000s. So they hadn't quite evolved to soil health yet. And they had these big conferences on soil quality just to define it. What does soil quality mean? And so you know all these scientists in the room trying to figure out, well, how exactly do we define soil quality? Since it's not really getting into the biology, you could think of soil quality in terms of what you're using it for, right? We make bricks out of soil. So some soils are good quality for making bricks or pottery. Some soils are good quality for, you know, putting in foundations for houses. And some soils are good quality for growing crops. And one of the problems is that they're not all mutually exclusive. So sometimes the best places to build are also sometimes the best places to grow crops. And you run into those issues as you get, you know, urban sprawl. But this idea of soil quality, they ultimately settled on the ability of a soil to carry out certain ecosystem functions. You know, what's an ecosystem function? Well, it's how well does the soil purify the water, or how well does the soil allow us to grow crops. So different ecosystem functions are sort of the things that soils naturally do that we kind of take for granted. Without getting too far into it, soil health and soil quality have been kind of used interchangeably. soil quality is less dependent on biology. And so the modern term that we keep hearing now is soil health, and we think about the biology and the microorganisms and the biodiversity. And then we think about what ultimately gets important to producers is, well, if it's so important, how do we quantify it? How can I track soil health if I'm a producer? And we figured out ways to do that. If we can track it, we can then think about looking at different management practices, cover cropping, crop rotation, adding compost, adding manure, and looking at the effects of those inputs on our system and developing a set of decisions that work for farmers to best manage their soil, best management practices. I always like to show this picture. It's a nice cover crop. It's a diverse cover crop. These are one of the ways that we can help build soil organic matter and build soil health. Looks like they've got some clover and some rye and maybe some hairy vetch, winter pea in there. So a mixture of legumes, which helps you get nitrogen in your soil, along with some rye to get you more carbon input, carbon to nitrogen ratio, right? It's important as we think about breaking down cover crops too. So as I said, and I'm not going to go through these definitions, we've kind of defined what soil health is. It's really how well does the soil do, how well does the soil do to provide us with benefits. Taking into account sort of all the facets of a soil, the biological facets, the physical facets, the chemical facets. Lots of things, lots of processes go into how well a soil performs in an ecosystem. And soil health has to take into account all of those facets and how well they're functioning. This looks like a nice, healthy soil, right, in this picture? If you were to look at that, what would be indications that that might be a healthy soil? I think I heard.
The dark color.
Yeah, the dark color, right? I mean, it's got a lot of organic matter in it, clearly. And I look at that and I can kind of see some granular structure there. Looks like air and water would move pretty well through that soil. There's some porosity to it, so it's going to hold water, it's going to hold air. It's got looks like some kind of a clover cover crop or something growing on top of it. And I've used this term ecosystem function or ecosystem service. That's just the benefits that people get from an ecosystem. Well, what benefits do people get from soil? Well, we take a lot of these for granted. It's a habitat. So in the top right, we've got a picture of an earthworm there. We talked about the red wigglers yet? Not yet today, right?
No, they're right here.
So we've got red wigglers in the room. But soil is a habitat, and we could see the wiggler or the night crawler, but there's all kinds of other organisms living in there: bacteria, fungi, arthropods. It's a really diverse habitat with a lot of community interactions. We don't think about soil as being involved in air, but if you're a plant root, you need air. And so there's air movement concerns. A healthy soil will facilitate that air movement. In the bottom left, we've got a picture of a river talking about water supply and purification. The chemical properties of the soil, especially high organic matter soils, allow the soil to act as a natural filter. We're sitting in Frankfort, Kentucky. You know where all the water comes from that we drink around here? The Kentucky River, right? And so it's in our best interest to keep the river clean. Yeah, it goes through some treatment plants before it comes out of the tap, but it's in our best interest to have healthy functioning soils as that sort of first pre-filter before it goes through some of those more industrial scale processes. And so that organic matter contributes to that soil's ability to filter out certain pollutants. And if all of it's working right, well, I didn't talk about decomposition, did I? So we got a nice cow patty up there. And as Gene said yesterday, what if all those things stacked up and didn't decompose? I think first of all, it's good to point out if that decomposition wasn't happening, we probably wouldn't be here anyway, because that's responsible for all the nutrient cycling that keeps our crops alive and keeps us alive. But decomposition is a ecosystem function inherent to soils, and if we didn't have that going on, like I said, we wouldn't be here, and there'd be a lot of waste sitting around or a lot of stuff just not doing anything. If it's all working well together, if you're a farmer, then that soil might be a good soil for growing crops. And as I said earlier, and as Michael correctly pointed out, the key manageable determinant for soil health is soil organic matter. Soil organic matter is related to nutrient cycling. It's related to soil structure, and that of course determines how well air and water can move through a soil. That organic matter is food. It's food for microorganisms. The same microorganisms that are carrying out a lot of the processes that Gene is talking about in composting are naturally occurring in soils and breaking down the dead plants, the dead animals, the poop, the pee, all the stuff that goes into a soil on a daily basis. The leaves that just fell off the trees, that's all food for the microorganisms in the soil. So I'm not going to go through all this because we're kind of constrained on time. But one of the coolest things, when I first started studying soil science, it dawned on me, this is freaking cool. Because I hated physics as a undergrad at University of Rochester. I got a 12. I got a 12 on an exam one time, and it was in physics. I hated physics.
Chemistry, I didn't do that well, but I can cite the periodic table.
I understand chemistry. That was a little more relatable, and physics was a little, less relatable for whatever reason. I was always into biology, so I kind of came from things from the biology perspective. But if you're going to study and understand soil, you have to understand the inner workings of all of those, and they all interact. The biology, the chemistry, the physical properties, it's all tied together in a soil. And it actually does help me to process physics better if I can relate it to something that's actually occurring, right? It's more applied physics, and that is a little bit, more accessible, I think, than some of the theories that we learn as undergraduates. Okay, I didn't just put the same slide in. I did, but I changed the title, right? Before it was, what does ecosystem services to soil provide? Well, what ecosystem services specifically is organic matter tied to? It's all the same stuff. So all the same stuff that we talk about soil delivering these benefits for that we take for granted, it's all related to organic matter content. And to a lesser degree, clay content, it's also important, but organic matter really controls a lot of it, and it can be managed. It's a lot harder to move clay into a soil or move sand into a soil if you have poor drainage, right? That's pretty expensive, hauling truckloads of mineral material around. But you can build organic matter over time through good management. This might be my favorite picture in soil science. This is a close-up of a plant root. And the root is the biggest thing you see. That's the tip of a plant root. This guy right here, here's one. And here's another root. That's the tip of a root. That's not an earthworm sneaking through the soil or something like that. That's a tip of a root. And so then what are those other things that look like roots squiggling around in there? Michael, you can't answer this. Fungi. So this is fungi, right? This is fungi. And then if you look real close at the roots, you can actually see little wisps of stuff coming off the roots. And those are what we call mycorrhizal fungi, and they live on the root, and they live within the root, and they help those roots access places in the soil that they wouldn't normally get. Now, we think of a tip of a root as being pretty small, like the width of a human hair. This is the tip of a root. But there are still places in the soil where that root can't penetrate, but those little fungi might be able to. And so those fungi live in the root, they live on the root. They help that root get access to water and nutrients in little pockets in the soil where that root can't get. And the fungi gets to freeload as the plant converts carbon dioxide into sugar. It sends some of that sugar to the roots, and the fungi gets to hang out in the roots and get a free meal. So, they're benefiting each other. Plus, they get to live in the root. And soil's a pretty harsh environment if you're just a microorganism hanging out there trying to make a living, right? Lots of other people competing for that carbon that you want to eat. Some of them releasing some chemical warfare, right? All the antibiotics that we depend on, a lot of those are derived from soil microorganisms. So, where am I going with this? Well, there was a famous scientist. You ever met Fred?
Yeah, I know Fred.
You know Fred, okay. I had to,
Part of not this book, but another,
yeah.
the soil book.
I had the pleasure of sitting with him at a Southern SOG conference over in Louisville. It's probably been about 12 years ago now, and we sat at a table. And he co-wrote a book with my advisor at University of Maryland, Ray Weil, which is Soil Organic Matter and Sustainable Systems. So Fred and Ray co-wrote that book. But before they wrote that book, Fred wrote Building Soils for Better Crops. Fred Magdoff and Harold Van Ness.
That's the one I know.
Yeah. And I mean, this is a great book. It was written like 1992, but it's been updated several times. And if you're a farmer and you want to learn how to build your soil for sustainability, long-term sustainability, and for crop productivity, that's the book. And you can get it for free from SARE. You can download it from SARE.
Did we get that book out to the, don't have a copy of that?
I don't know, but you can download it for free from SARE.
Oh, Brooke had it.
Brooke might have had a hard copy of it. Yeah. But the thing I love about that book is that, they're good scientists. Both Van Ness and Magdoff are brilliant scientists, and they know how to put together a research paper. But they wrote this book to be accessible to people that don't speak scientific language. So anybody can pick it up and make sense of what they're saying. But they divided soil organic matter into sort of three different components. The living, and so we're looking at things like the roots and the microorganisms and the little bugs and insects and mites and nematodes that we really can't see with our naked eye for the most part, but they're there. And then we've got the bacteria and the fungi that are really responsible for a lot of the chemical decomposition that takes place in soils. They use enzymes and break down lots of things that other things can't break down. And then they talk about the dead, which is like your recently deposited stuff. So I put a picture of corn residues here over at University of Kentucky Spindletop Farm. Incidentally, if you look, you can see a ridge in this top picture. Can anybody see this kind of ridge that goes back right here? These are two different plots in the same research experiment. The plot on the left is long-term no-till, and the plot on the right is long-term till. They've been in these treatments for like 40 years when this picture was taken. And the difference in elevation, this is flat, so you're not getting a lot of erosion. The difference in elevation, anybody want to take a guess on what the difference in elevation is from? Maybe worms, but organic matter content. And so you have a much higher bulk density. In other words, you have more soil particles packed into a given volume in this plot because it's been plowed and plowed and plowed, and your organic matter has been lost to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, whereas in the other one you're accumulating organic matter, which is a sponge, and it kind of holds water and fluffs things up. And so there's about a 6-inch differential between the two plots. And the coolest thing, I took this picture when I was a graduate student. The coolest thing was before I came to Kentucky and went to UK to get my PhD, I was at The Ohio State University working on a PhD. My wife convinced me that it was in my best interest to transfer and come down here. That's how I got to Kentucky, right? I left Ohio State for the girl.
You're a good husband.
Will you give her a call for me? But at Ohio State, they had plots up in Worcester. Anybody ever been through Worcester? They have plots up in Worcester the triplet Van Doren plots. These are known as the Blevins and Fry plots at Kentucky, because those were the guys that established them. Triplet and Van Doren put in similar plots up at Ohio State, actually before UK's plots, and you see the same thing, the same little elevation difference. The point of this slide, though, is not to get sidetracked on the cool, organic matter stuff, but the point is we're talking about the recently deposited residues. That's stuff that microbes can attack. That's microorganism food. It's easily decomposed, and it promotes structure and microbial activity and nutrient release. That's all tied into this like recently dead pool of stuff. And then there's the stuff that Gene makes. The very dead, right? I mean, this is essentially organic matter that's been sitting around for long enough to go through several cycles of decomposition. And it's like the most resistant stuff that's left over, which is what we get if we turn a compost pile well enough and we get that good finished compost. You're left with that organic matter that is what we call recalcitrant. It doesn't want to break down any further. You don't want to eat a meal that's already been eaten, neither do microorganisms, right? So this is the stuff that's sitting around leaves. It's got that dark color. It's really good for nutrient. It's got some good chemistry qualities related to cation exchange, which is beyond the scope of this. But just understand that because of the chemistry qualities of this organic matter, it helps hold nutrients in the soil. It's that spongy, fluffy stuff that is good for water holding and air movement and promotes good soil structure, which allows good root penetration. That's me as a graduate student over at University of Kentucky after I left the Ohio State for the girl and came down here and worked with Mark Williams and Elisa D'Angelo over at University of Kentucky. Still indebted to them. But when we think of soil health, you can't just measure one thing. I said it's about all different facets of how a soil is functioning. So you can't just measure crop yield. That might be what's most important to you, but you can't just measure that. You got to look at the overall ecosystem functioning. And so that's really what I've been interested in for the better part of 20 years. You can have some components that kind of the soil that give it an inherent property. We're here in Kentucky. We have karst, limestone underneath our soils. Most of the soils here in Frankfurt have been forming in limestone, and that gives certain properties to our soils. Some of those native properties, they're hard to change. We can't change the fact that we're in Kentucky and we have limestone soils. Where I did my master's degree in Maryland, we had coastal plain soils, so it was ocean sediments. And so that's going to determine some of the aspects of soil health. What are you working with to begin with? But the part that we can change, again, gets back to this idea that we can manipulate organic matter. We can build it. Or if we mismanage it, we can lose it. If we want to think about the stuff that we want to measure, if Keith sends a soil sample in, did you send your sample in yet, Keith?
I did. Thank you for that.
Yeah, so you're going to get it back and you're going to get a report and it's going to say, oh, Keith, your pH is 5.7. You better add some lime. You can change that pretty quick and you'll see a response in your crops. That's not something we can measure to measure soil health overall. That's a quick changing property. If you are low nitrogen, you can add a fertilizer and your crop is going to respond. And like I said, we can't change that here in Kentucky, we're in limestone. So these more permanent things, you can't change that. If you bought a piece of land and you're on the side of a slope, unless you pay a lot of money, to have your slope leveled out, you can't really change that, right? We can't change that New York's climate is different from Kentucky's climate. So all of those things are going to affect how well a soil performs for certain purposes. But the things that we can change and also measure are the things that are related to organic matter. So aggregation is really just soil structure. And again, how well does air and water move through a soil? Microbial biomass, I can measure that in my laboratory. Basal respiration, I can measure. This labile carbon is more microbially active carbon. And why am I talking about carbon interchangeably? with soil organic matter, it's because I'm a soil scientist and I think about them somewhat interchangeably. Soil organic matter is about 58% carbon. So if you hear me slipping between, soil carbon, soil organic matter, they're not the same thing, but soil carbon is about 58% of soil organic matter. So if we're trying to estimate soil organic matter, most commonly we estimate carbon. And if you send your soil sample in, so Keith, you sent your soil sample in, and they're going to give you a reading on soil organic matter.
You did 3 tests. Remember those?
You did the routine test, you did micronutrients, and I think you did organic matter, right? Mm-hmm. And so you're going to get a reading back, and it's going to say, well, Keith, your soils are hopefully in pretty good shape, up around 2.5%, 3% organic matter. But what they really measure is carbon. They burn off all the carbon. It might. Well, in your pastures, I bet it would.
Okay.
No? Yeah, we'll see. We'll get you there. We need to get you there.
Because it was basically 0 when we got it.
Yeah. They measure carbon, and then they'll back calculate organic matter. They'll actually multiply whatever your carbon is by 1.72, I think it is, or 0.58. They'll divide by 0.58, 58%, and that's how they actually calculate your soil organic matter, by measuring your carbon. So you'll hear me slip back and forth between those two. This is me out in the field with the labile carbon test. It's a pretty cool little field kit. You could shake some soil up in a test tube and measure the amount of, you could estimate the amount of what we call active carbon by a color change. And this is really responsive to management. So a farmer, if he knows the right people, the problem is this isn't super accessible to farmers right now. Well, or call your extension folks, right? And if you have the right extension folks. Now, Cornell has a soil health lab, right? Is that still operational?
Sending you the soil health, the new ones.
Okay.
They're really well.
And they are using this test in the soil health lab, or at least they were, the last time I looked.
They're not sending out any more kits.
Okay.
Do you know Bob? Because you could influence him. I'm like,
No, but we should talk about this after. I'd love to have a conversation about it.
absolutely.
A lot of this stuff isn't easily accessible to farmers. Now, you could send your samples to Waters, and they are a for-profit soil testing lab, and they'll give you some things that are related to all the things that we're talking about, like this the Solvito CO2 burst test. That's getting at this, how well is your microbial community performing. SLAN, that's active nitrogen. I can't remember. I'm drawing a blank in my mind about what SL stands for right now, but it's active nitrogen, and they're trying to give you a biologically available nitrogen estimate. They actually will do this permanganate oxidizable carbon test. You cannot do that at UK's testing lab, right? So my point here is we're trying to talk about soil health. And in the bigger context, we now have, as I was telling Jim Coleman when he was here earlier, we have programs that are incentivizing farmers financially. If you can put carbon in your soil and document it, we'll pay you. These grant programs, they're climate smart commodities projects. If you're interested in any of these, I'm involved with 2 of them that are actively recruiting farmers right now. And we can talk after about that. But how do you start quantifying this stuff if farmers don't have access to it, and it all requires expensive? Because the point here is that basic organic matter tests, they take a few years to really show a difference. Unless you're really piling on the compost or really piling on the manure, it's going to take a few years to show a difference just from putting in like cover crops and reducing tillage. So, but these things are a little better than basic organic matter, the basic organic matter test that a soil testing lab. But they're expensive.
Dr. Lucas, you're talking about carbon, and am I correct in thinking when referencing climate change and the impact of the climate, our environment, has on our environment, Can you make the connection with the carbon in our soil and the carbon that's polluting and impacting our climate?
There are estimates out there, and you can find these, I believe they are either EPA or USDA estimates, that say that a third of our carbon emissions are coming from agricultural operations and or land use change. In other words, taking forested land and converting a forest to an open field where we're growing corn or soybeans, something like that, right? Think about a forest, and you got trees and vines and understory, and there's usually something green living in every single pocket that it can live in and catch a little bit of sunlight, and then it's converting that sunlight into sugar, and then ultimately into plant material like a tree trunk. And a tree trunk's going to stay around for a long time, right? How long does a corn plant stay around? Yeah, 90 to 120 days, depending on your variety, right? And so there's a big difference between the way a forest is collecting and capturing and storing carbon and the way it's happening in a farm field, at least in terms of what we think of as a modern farm field, right? Which is why now these climate smart commodities grants have, yes, you can make the connection. And the connection is now, like, if we can keep the carbon in our soil instead of having it in our atmosphere, it's not going to solve the problem. We've got this whole other set of things that we need to do that's policy-wise, and the way that humans behave and consume energy, right? That's another big part of the puzzle. But the agricultural component is one drop in the bucket, and every drop counts. Does that make sense?
Is the organic matter and carbon interchanged or connected?
Yes. So it's coming. Plants convert carbon dioxide to sugars, and then they convert those sugars into things like cellulose, which they turn into plant leaves and plant stalks and plant roots. Or there's carbon in the fruits that we eat and the vegetables that we eat. But some of that stuff gets put back in the soil and decomposes, and then that carbon in those plants becomes carbon in the soil. So if you got the plants taking the carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it into the soil, and if you can keep it in the soil without losing too much back, then you're a net gain, in that part of the equation, right? Well, we still have all these other parts of the equation to figure out, right? We're all driving around in our Hummers and our big diesel trucks, and right? Even my Prius. I felt good about my Prius a few years ago, but it still has a gas tank. And I'm like, well, now maybe I got to get a Tesla, but I don't know. I'm going to have to get a raise first, right? But back to soil health. So we can measure it. We also know that experienced farmers, know what healthy soil looks like. Somebody in the audience, not Michael, because you took the class, which one of those is a healthier soil? Why are we saying the right? Yeah, it's got structure.
Like 10 worms in it. I can see the worms.
You see worms, you see roots, right? It's kind of more. There's a texture to it, right? And I don't mean a texture like amount of sand, silt, and clay. I got to be very careful because soil scientists talk about texture, and that's like your proportions of sand, silt, and clay. But the way it just looks kind of more granular, and looks like it's just got more ways for roots to move through it and air to pass through it, right? And that nice dark color. It's the same exact soil in two different fields. So one is this is up in Pennsylvania, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania area. And that is my former advisor, Ray Weil, at University of Maryland. And he is holding in his left hand soil from, anybody ever heard of Steve Groff? He's a long-term no-till farmer up in central Pennsylvania, Lancaster area. And so these fields were probably in no-till for 20 years when this picture was taken. And his neighbor, the only thing separating the fields is a fence. His neighbor tills all the time. And that's the difference between long-term no-till. Have you heard of Steve Groff? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Central Pennsylvania, no-till cover crop guy.
Yeah.
Farmers can tell, right? So we know soil's a healthy soil kind of will smell like a finished compost, really. It'll have an earthy smell. It'll crumble differently than an unhealthy soil. You know, so it'll have a dark color. You can tell. And my friend and colleague Joel Groover, a few years back, he did a study working with farmers, and he found that all the things that farmers were seeing in their soils and noting as an indicator of soil health, all those things that those farmers were pointing out were actually related to the amount of soil organic matter in the soil. I lost my pointer. I'm going to skip over this for a minute. This is just showing us that we can change it, right? If we this picture here on the bottom, we can, if we're managing our soil badly, that red line indicates the potential decline in soil organic matter. You know, if we've reached some kind of an equilibrium, you know, there can be a little holding pattern where there's, you know, a sort of a rise and fall, but overall it's kind of the same average, and it can be stable. And maybe you've gotten to the low point there, right? Maybe that's where you get to the low point and you're just kind of hanging on and you're adding lots of fertilizer to keep your crop. You're almost growing hydroponically at that point because your soil isn't really a healthy soil, and you have to add a whole lot of stuff to get productivity out of it. Or you could see improvements. And so you've changed management practices, and now you're adding cover crops to your production, now you're adding compost, now you're adding manure, and you're building that soil carbon back up. Keith, this answers your question, right? Is the climate issue, the carbon in the atmosphere, related to the carbon in the soil? It's all linked. It's all linked. Just like, you know, the water here in Kentucky is linked to the Ohio River, is linked to the Mississippi River, is linked to the Gulf of Mexico. Well, the carbon in the atmosphere is linked to the carbon in the plants and is linked to the carbon in the soil. It's a cycle. It's a cycle.
So if my soil carbon footprint increases, so now I'm going to get into some net return.
Yeah, I mean, you're doing two things. If you're building carbon in your soil, you're creating a healthier soil, and you're also, hopefully, helping to keep carbon out of the atmosphere. So we're going to jump into some different ideas about promoting soil health. And these are things that I talk about a lot in what I do here at Kentucky State. Diversified crop rotations. Of course, I work in organic, you know, and the organic program. If you're certified organic, what does that mean, Keith, about crop rotations?
Well,
you have to do it, right? You have to do it. Good.
certain practices have to be demonstrated.
Yeah, you've got to be able to have your inspector come to your farm and look at your organic systems plan and be able to tell, all right, Keith had tomatoes here in the summer and he had lettuce here in the fall, then he put in a cover crop, and then in the spring he terminated his cover crop and put in.
Does that by my note taking and my
Yep.
all the above, and also by testing the soil. They got a test that can tell what vegetables been in the soil.
Aha. No, I haven't seen that one yet.
I thought they did. They can tell what vegetable thrives in a particular soil dynamic.
All right. I'm going to learn more about that one.
Okay.
Good question.
Okay, this works. I understand how you're putting carbon into the soil, and I feel like I vaguely understand how carbon leaves the soil in a gaseous form into the atmosphere. But maybe on a practical level, just like on day to day on a farm, what does that look like? Carbon escaping the soil.
It's happening all the time, right? And as things decompose, I mean, it's always happening. You're never going to stop it, and that's not the point. We just want a net accumulation of where you're putting more carbon in that is going to stay there in a form that's more long-term, because those more long-term carbon forms, like compost or like what we call humus, That's stable. It stays there a long time. It promotes soil health. It promotes air movement. It promotes water holding. It promotes nutrient holding and nutrient cycling. So the more you have, the better off you are. And I'll show you something real practical here in a slide or two that's actually got some finances tied to organic matter accumulation. I don't know, is that sort of?
Yeah, on the practical side, I guess I always just think of tilling. I've heard tilling exposes soil to the atmosphere, and through that, carbon is released. So I don't know, but if I don't till, am I capturing carbon and not releasing it? And I understand that, as you're saying, carbon always leaves, and we're just fitting in practices that holds more of it long term, like stable, like it increases the stability of it.
Tillage, to answer your part of your question, tillage does, again, that's no-till on the right, and it's the same exact soil and just with a fence separating it, right? Two different fields separated by a fence, but it's the same exact soil inherently. Just the difference there is management on two sides of a fence. And so yeah, the reduction of tillage will help you build that organic matter, which promotes all these other good things. I'm organic, right? And we till all the time. I'm not saying tillage is bad wholesale, but it's got to be offset by other things that put that carbon back in. Because when you do till, you're dragging a piece of metal through the soil, you're causing the soil to be broken up and air comes in, but also as that air comes in, little pockets of the soil where organic matter was trapped get exposed. And so before, the microorganisms couldn't get to it, but you've now broken up that little cluster of soil particles and it's exposed, and now that's released, and they chew that up real quick and it gets released as carbon dioxide. So yeah, over the long term, if you're tilling and not offsetting, then you can, that's when you start getting into a loss. Does that make sense?
Maybe I'll try to ask a few more questions afterwards. Yes, it does make sense. Yes, it does make sense, but I might just have a few follow-up questions for later.
I mean, I work in the organic realm, and we have to till or we have weed problems, right? Yeah. And I shouldn't say that wholesale because I'm about to start a project that's organic no-till, and we're investigating that with like high-intensity cover cropping and crimper rolling, but that's probably beyond where I want to get with this. But we do still see accumulation of soil organic matter in our soils because we're offsetting with a crop rotation. I've got pictures in here that'll show you some data. A crop rotation that includes 3 years of animals on pasture. So we're growing corn 1 year, soybean the next year, doing lots of tillage while we do that. Then we take it out of crop production and we put it into goats on pasture for 3 years, and we watch our organic matter go back up. Now that's kind of a more extreme way to do it, but there are other ways to get organic matter back into the soil after that tillage action exposes and causes a loss of soil organic matter. Yeah. Cover crops are one of my favorite ways. We use cover crops here. If you were out at the farm yesterday, I didn't get a chance to point it out, but as we were coming out of the little shed where we met at first before we went back to the back of the farm, if you looked across the gravel road, you'd see these little strips of green stuff coming up in the field, and that was rye and vetch that I planted about a month and a half ago. And by March of next year, I'm hoping it'll be about up to my knee, and I'll terminate that, and I won't take it out of the field. I just leave it there. It decomposes in the field and turns into soil organic matter for me. Cover crops were originally used or promoted by National Resources Conservation Service. Back then it was Soil Conservation Service, to prevent erosion. You keep the soil covered, the rain doesn't hit the soil, and then you don't have that rainfall impact picking up those soil particles and carrying them where you don't want them. So you're cutting off that impact, but at the same time, these cover crops, they keep the soil covered and protect from erosion while they're growing, but you're also sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, turning it into plant material, and when you kill that crop and leave it decompose right there in the field, now you're building soil organic matter and getting all those benefits that we associate with soil organic matter. If you do it right, you may even be able to reduce weed pressure. That's one of the things we're going to investigate in the organic no-till project we've got going next year. I think manure additions are good. We're in central Kentucky. We've got lots of cows and lots of horses. And so you can usually find some manure locally. So if you're especially if you're a small scale farmer, this might be an option. It's a little bit trickier when you're larger scale, unless you're, raising a real big herd, then you usually spread it back on your own land. That manure's got to go somewhere, especially if you've got a confinement operation. But this builds soil microorganisms, it recycles nutrients. Just like compost, manure stimulates healthy microbial communities. And as you stimulate those healthy microbial communities, they can sometimes outcompete the bad guys that could cause plant disease. Does take a little bit of planning with manure. The rule of thumb is that the manure I put on next spring, if it's 10% nitrogen, that's awful high. If it's 2.5% nitrogen, I'm only going to get about 1.25% nitrogen released that year. So about 50% of the nitrogen that's in your manure is going to be released that first year you put it on. And then half of what's left will get released the next year. So you got to think about that. It's not like putting ammonium nitrate out on your field where you immediately get those benefits. This is more of a slow release, and so it might not be your only source. But if you're combining manure with a cover crop that's got legumes in it, now you've got nitrogen coming in with your legumes. You've got nitrogen coming out of your manure. And you might be able to meet the total needs of your crops if you have a healthy soil with high organic matter that has good natural nutrient cycling. Here's why we're here, right? Compost. This is a nice windrow. As I said before, compost is really essentially that humus, that most very dead type of soil organic matter. And when you add this, it helps contribute to that humus pool in the soil, stable organic matter, builds structure. Air movement, water holding is all related to structure. The chemistry of compost helps with nutrient holding. All the things that we've already talked about a couple times, promoting bacteria and fungi, suppressing diseases. This is a great way to recycle too. We've already talked about recycling, carcasses or food scraps or whatever. Have you ever thought, this is something that always, and people sometimes ask me this question, I just don't have a great answer. The carbon dioxide coming out of compost, when we're talking about global climate change, carbon dioxide budgets, how much carbon dioxide comes out of compost and how much does that contribute to?
There is CO2 that comes out. It doesn't contribute as much as methane and other things would. And we've actually done, I did our compost site, or I didn't. Mary did ran our compost site as a small city because we take in our food waste, we take in our animal waste, we take in everything. So I wanted the whole picture to be like a small town, And we did the whole climate footprint of that. And really the machinery, depending on how far you have to haul that stuff, that's what affects your climate footprint. How often you turn.
Yeah.
If you're not turning a lot, you're not giving off as much. If you turn, you'll give off ammonia and CO2 and everything else will just go up in that steam that we see coming off of a pile. So it's, I will share, I'm doing links for you guys to send to people, but I'll share that carbon footprint thing also, so you can at least, look at it and see, what we're looking at nobody's taken tunnels and thrown them over the piles. They've done it with some of the manures,
Yeah.
but they haven't yet done it with compost to see.
But
And
if
the
you're
manures came out
composting,
real bad.
if you're composting right, you're already working with carbon that's above
Exactly.
ground anyway. So in the grand scheme of things, you're not introducing new carbon the way we are with burning fuel.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. No, this is, definitely has a good carbon footprint. I'll say one more thing about that, and that is when we actually use it, it triples our carbon, makes our carbon footprint 3 times better by using it.
By
If we
using it.
just leave it in that pile, it's not helping anything.
Right.
It doesn't improve our footprint. But when we use it, when we put it on our plants and use it, incorporate it and stuff like that, it really helps.
Footprint, are you talking about,
It's taking into account all the fossil fuels and all the emissions that would come off of something. So we're looking at the gas, we're looking at diesel, we're looking at, moving things over road. Like I said, don't intentionally haul stuff from 50 miles away to compost it. It's just not worth it. It costs more in terms of emission.
Plus, it's probably heavy, right? And costs more just on a practical level. Yeah.
Anything over road is a fortune right now.
Yeah. So, and I did put a couple of slides in here about specifically organic stuff, right? Because I know Keith is certified. Anybody in here otherwise thinking about being certified? David, you were certified at one point. Are you still certified? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And if you're certified organic and you want to use manure and compost, there are rules. And so if you want to put manure out on your field, depending on what you're growing, you have to allow yourself 90 to 120 days from the point when you introduce raw manure to a field to when you can harvest, right? And manure is important. It's one of the key ways that organic farmers, because we can't put in fertilizers, it's one of the key ways that organic farmers can get a good shot of nutrients in the soil and build soil organic matter. So that can have implications. That's the thing you got to plan for. If you're harvesting spinach, which touches the ground, it's got to be 120 days after you applied that manure is when you can harvest that spinach. Something like tomatoes that are trellised up and not touching the ground, or corn, that's 90 days because the fruit isn't touching the ground. So they're worried about the reason they put this rule in there, and I don't know if there's really any good science behind it. I've never been able to find, I think it's kind of arbitrary, where they figure, well, this will be enough time. But what they're trying to do is prevent pathogen contamination from the manure, from things like rainfall impact and splash up on your crop. So they figure, well, 120 days, that's all, what is that, almost half a year, right? So 4 months, third of a year, right? Yeah. But if you're composting, you can put that product right on. There's a separate set of rules you got to follow for compost, especially and we're talking about specifically composted manure here, or animal material. So if you're in windrows, you've got to reach 131 to 170 degrees Fahrenheit. I think someone asked me about, was it you guys asked me about this yesterday? For 15 days and turn it 5 times in that period. In a static vessel, which I think these would be more of the aerated, where they're pumping. Aerated.
Turn windows. This is called a turn window.
This is a turn windrow, but a static vessel are those piles that you have with the pipes in it, right? That have the air.
Possibly, or just the wood chips underneath.
Okay.
Static pile is it's not a vessel, actually.
Yeah, and I'm not, but that's the language in the National Organic Program standards, and I'm not familiar with that, and I don't hear too many people asking about it. More people that I know are interested in windrowing.
But I don't remember ever seeing that. I just ignored it.
So if you use that process, the static vessel or aerated pile, I should have put that specifically in here. The language in the National Organic Program is static vessel or aerated pile which to me means forced air, because they're specifically carving out windrows and turning it forced air. Then you only have to reach those temperatures for 3 days. Did you have a question?
Yeah, a question about the manure. Does it have to be, can I use any manure, or does it have to be?
They don't clarify. Yeah, so that's the language coming. I've paraphrased it, but it's pretty close to what is written right in the National Organic Program. So it can be horse manure, it can be goat manure, it can be cow manure. It just can't be human manure.
But they didn't have to be organic. The feedstock.
No. It's a really good question, and I have had debates with my graduate students about this and other people involved in organic. You don't have to use organic manure. You don't have to use manure from organic animals on certified organic land. It will not throw you out of compliance with the National Organic Program. If you're here in Kentucky and you have goats or sheep, you have to use anti-parasiticals. It's pretty much a given. I know one organic farm that has sheep, and he has an absolutely 100% closed herd of organic sheep. In other words, he has a quarantine process, and he's very careful whenever he brings in new animals, and so he has been able to maintain a certified organic herd. John Bell, over at Elmwood Stock Farm. I'm not aware of it. You know any other organic sheep herds, David, in the state? I'm not aware of any. But John does a really good job of controlling what comes in and what goes out. But for the most part, goats and sheep, they get gut parasites. Yeah. And you give them the anti-parasiticals, and part of it gets used to kill the gut parasites. Where's the rest of it go?
Right.
In the poop.
Pooped out. Yeah,
and then if you put that on your field, now you've got prohibited substances coming out of the butt of an animal and in your field, right? But that's okay, according to...
So ivermectin, that's what you're using, right?
Yeah.
For worms. So
yeah.
Ivermectin's used on everything from squirrels to horses to, to everybody. Everybody used, to us. We actually looked at the breakdown of ivermectin in the soil, because we were pretty worried about continuous wormers and horses and stuff like that. And they hit the ground, and what are they doing to the microbial activity in the ground and all that kind of stuff. So we looked at it, and when horses are on continuous wormers, and it takes about, we can wipe out or mineralize the ivermectin in about 6 days of composting. If it just goes on the ground, if it's just pooped out, then it doesn't really break down very quickly. It's just hanging out there.
Yeah.
But if it's put in a compost pile, it does.
There was a guy at University of Minnesota, I think his last name is Lundgren, but I might be getting that wrong. But he did a really cool study looking at manure and its effects on dung beetles. Mm-hmm. And so ivermectin doesn't just impact these gut parasites. It can have non-target effects. And of course, the dung beetles are really important in that first step of processing waste, right? They make, they'll make the little balls, roll it around. Some of them don't make the balls. They just kind of eat it up and carry it down into the soil. But that's part of one of the first steps. And if your poop is laden with stuff that's going to hurt the dung beetle, well, that's hurting ecological processes then. Yeah. So my opinion as an organic, it's really tough. My opinion as an organic purist, kind of sort of organic purist, right? Mm-hmm. I'm like, well, maybe we shouldn't be doing that. But we wouldn't have enough organic manure to meet the needs of organic farmers if we made this rule that said you can only use organic manure from organic animals.
Yeah. And we'll never have enough organic, totally certified organic compost to use anywhere, not even on organic farms. We won't get there. Yeah. We do have some herds that are, got up to a 300 cow herd that is totally organic. There's another 100 cow, but like this is little drops in the bucket. Yeah. We can't do that. So when like NOFA or one of the certifying organizations certify your stuff, it's certified, the compost is certified for organic use. And what you do is they're worried about some of the chemicals that you do use on your animals. So they'll ask you all these questions about, different aspects of your management. Are you spraying your cows with ivermectin? Are you, all that kind of stuff. And then they'll make the determination whether it's too much or it's passable for you to be used in organic agriculture.
Yeah.
But there's no way, even with food waste, we'll never get to that point. There's going to be some residuals, pesticide residuals and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's in
And I've been told by inspectors and certification reviewers and certifying agencies that if perchance you do put manure on and it has high enough levels of some kind of prohibited substance in it to create a noticeable problem, well, then you're responsible for it and you could be found out of compliance and you might have to actually take that field out of certified organic production.
Right. I think people wanted to have a discussion about, I don't know, not in or anything, but a discussion about aminoperlid and the herbicides that kill broadleaves that are used on hay. So we have, do you want to do it now, or I didn't get to it when I was in there? But
I don't have, but I got a few more slides to cover.
Yeah, I was just thinking with the.
But we could-
But we can go either way.
Yeah.
We'll do that one afterwards. right?
Dr. Lucas, I would want to say, when we did that field day demonstration on soil, we were surrounded by a bunch of vegetable producers like myself, and they said, well, what about just potting soil for our vegetables production? Then what about organic compost? And then ultimately, what about manure? And they had like 3 examples. And then manure by itself, it said over time. So I want to bring it up because we're talking about manure. Then can manure be like an elixir? Like we think it's magical and it's going to solve all our woes and all our problems. But over time and using too much of it, will it become detrimental to our operation?
That all depends on management. It depends on when you apply it and whether you incorporate it or not. If you apply it and leave it sit and you get a heavy rainfall that causes your manure to end up in the creek next to your property, well, now it's a problem, right? But there are ways to control that if you spread it and incorporate it, or you get plants established in it like a cover crop shortly after you spread it, then you're doing the things to manage it. And it does break down, and all of it does cycle. So, if you do apply too much and your soil's already got a lot of biological nitrogen in it, you could have nitrogen leaching problems and things like that. So, yeah, agriculture is always a system where we're trying to balance the good things that we're doing with the bad things we could do differently, right? So, or try to manage better. So, I guess the answer is it depends. It depends.
Come on now.
And and while we're here, I heard a couple things that, as the organic guy, I got to clarify. I heard certified organic compost, and you said somebody said organic manure. There is no certified organic compost. There is no certified organic manure. What is certified organic is what comes off your farm. Your certified organic tomatoes, your certified organic corn, your certified organic beef. That's the product of your farm. The inputs, like manure, if you're buying bag manure from Home Depot, you can buy a bag of manure and it'll say approved for use in organic. And then it'll usually have like OMRI, Organic Materials Research Institute, right? So there are materials approved for use in organic. Those are the things you put in, right? Those are your inputs. Yeah. The certified stuff is what's coming off your farm that you're selling. That's the stuff you put the logo on. And I get that question all the time. Well, I want a certified organic fertilizer. Well, there's no such thing as a certified organic fertilizer. There's fertilizer approved for use in organic, right? But This is the project I was talking about a little earlier, and I'll skim through this really quick in the interest of time. We've got a 5-year rotation, corn, soybean, and then 3 years of goats on pasture. These goats are not organic. And so with relation to that manure question earlier, these goats are pooping out imidacloprid, or ivermectin rather, maybe both. So as a purist, I'm always like, I don't like that. But as a researcher, I take advantage of the fact that we've got the goats right here on the farm, and I could put them on my plots. And we're just looking at, okay, we know while we're tilling this soil, we're beating it up. What can we do to regenerate it? And actually, regenerate is sort of a hot word in agriculture right now. And this is sort of a big concept in regenerative ag, is incorporation of livestock into crop rotations. Alan Savory had been talking about this for years, and people have sort of caught on to it. The animals are pooping and peeing on that land, but more importantly, that land is not being disturbed. You're not tilling it. You've got a pasture on it. That pasture's got a diverse group of plants growing on it. Some have deep roots, some have shallow roots, some have fibrous roots, some have tap roots. So you've got all kinds of different functions taking place there, and we're not ever tilling it. And so for that whole 3 years, we're building above ground biomass. We're having goats come in and poop and pee, and that's organic matter in my soil. And then we got all those roots from all those plants, and they don't just live forever. They live, and some of them die off, and it grows new roots, and then some more die off, and that all turns into organic matter. And so when we established this, we were hoping that we could demonstrate that this type of land management would offset, as I was talking about before, offsetting the sort of bad stuff we do when we till. I'm going to skim over that. Know that anything you do in farming involves planning. I think that's safe to say, right? And so if you're applying inputs, you have to apply so that you're not going to have your manure run off into your creek. Or you're going to know that your manure, only 50% of those nutrients in that manure are going to be available that year. And if you're doing multiple inputs like compost and manure and cover crops, well, there's potential interactions there, and you need to understand those, and that all takes a little bit of learning and understanding and planning. And I always recommend, if you're doing something new on your farm, try it in a small spot first. Try it in a small spot first where you can afford to maybe take a hit in the interest of trying to figure out what's better. If it doesn't go right, you haven't wasted, your whole production. Yeah. These are some more pictures of our goats. You can see in the back we got the corn growing behind them. That's the first phase of the crop rotation. I'm not sure whether this is the first, second, or third year of the goats on pasture, but they're hanging out there doing their thing. You might ask, what are these blue tubes? And those blue tubes are actually one of the other questions that's related to organic matter, but not directly related, is are the goats adding nitrogen or phosphorus to the groundwater that could potentially be a contaminant downstream? And so we're doing water sampling under these plots and measuring nitrogen. And those blue tubes are where we access our water samplers that are under the plots, where we could then draw out some soil water and measure nitrogen and phosphorus.
So just a straight tube down into water, into the groundwater?
There are actually a series of tubes in here, and they lead out into the plot. And there's one at the bottom. This is on a slightly sloped area, so we've got one at the bottom-ish part of the slope and one at the top-ish part. They're both kind of semi-central to the plot. Try to keep it away from the boundary of the plot. But they're, one is sort of upslope and one is sort of downslope. So there's two samplers in there. We put a vacuum pump on it, draw the water out. They're ceramic-tipped water samplers. My crew, you guys just tried to do this the other day, right, Shawn? And we got some water, but not as much. We need a little more rainfall. So this is semi-rainfall dependent, and we've had a dry summer, fall. So there's our goats. You might wonder why the hay wagon is in there. See what I did there, David? I didn't call it a trailer. It's a hay wagon. Well, and they like shade too. So they'll crawl under it if it's real hot, and they'll climb up on it if it's if they just are feeling adventurous. Yeah. We've graduated to some more portable shelters. This was a couple of years ago. We were using the hay wagons then. We still use them in a pinch. This is after the goats leave. The one plot on the right has not been grazed recently. Actually, that plot is a check plot. We never grazed that plot. And that sort of allows us to measure the difference between goats and non-goats in the pasture in terms of nutrient pollution or potential nutrient pollution. We're actually not seeing nutrient pollution in these systems, so that means that it's probably a sustainable system. We're not getting levels that are above what would be considered polluting for nitrogen or phosphorus. There's what the goats leave behind, right? Little pellets, goat pellets. One of my students defended their thesis 2 weeks ago, and they were talking about the inputs of organic matter from the goat pellets, and one of the other scientists in the room at this poor student's defense said, well, how do you quantify that? Did you track how much poop was coming out? And the poor student was like, well, no, that was a little beyond the scope of what he answered it well. He said it wouldn't be practical to do that. And so then I asked the professor, I said, well, do you know where to get goat diapers? Right? Where can we get some goat diapers? Maybe we can quantify this, right?
So you can calibrate it.
That's right. Measure it, and then you calibrate it.
So a few pictures back, you saw me in the field with the handheld spectrophotometer and the purple solution. That is the permanganate oxidizable carbon test. It tests more labile carbon, more microbial accessible carbon in the soil. And we use that test in these plots at the farm, and we were able to show that over time, or not over time, this is all within one season, spring of 2021, but we actually have every phase of the crop rotation represented every season. And so we have corn, soybean, pasture 1, pasture year 2, pasture year 3. There are enough plots out there to represent each one of those treatments. And so this CNP is where it's just it's a negative check plot. I told you about the plot where we have pasture, but we never put goats on it. That's sort of a positive, undisturbed check plot, and we called that PP for perennial pasture. We called the other one CNP for continuous non-pasture. In other words, it's getting continuous corn, soybean. And then CS1 is corn, CS2 is soybean, pasture year 1, pasture year 2, pasture year 3. And this is measuring that labile carbon. And so you can see that first year after we've tilled the soil and put it into corn, and this was at the very sort of towards the beginning of our study, so the corn plots had never had pasture. And now we're in the second 5 years of the study, so I'm interested to see how this looks going long term. But at the outset of this, our corn plots were testing as far as oxidizable carbon from this permanganate method at the same level, and you could think about this test as sort of a proxy for organic matter. It's a quick and dirty way to measure organic matter in the field or in the lab, and it's a little more sensitive to management than sending your samples to UK and having them measure soil organic matter over there. But as we move through pasture, you can see that our organic matter is creeping up to where it is when we never till it. So that tells me that over the course of a 5-year rotation, we know we're doing damage when we put corn and soybean in, but we're getting it almost to the point where it's undisturbed after 3 years of pasture. This is soil aggregates, which is soil structure. The order is a little different, and I apologize for that. So I've got the pasture over on the left and the crop sites over on the right. But just if I lined them up right, it'd still be about the same trend where you see this 3 years of pasture, you're getting up kind of close to where you are if you never till it at all. Whereas if you're down here growing corn or soybean, we've got lower levels of organic matter. So again, this kind of means, well, if we're managing it right and incorporating this type of practice, it's going to regenerate some of the damage we do when we till. So what do we need in the long term? We probably need more stuff like this. And hopefully what I'm talking about is accessible. I try to put this stuff in like layman's terms. I know when I start talking about permanganate oxidizable carbon, might cause eyes to gloss over. That sounds too sciencey, right? But you know, if I put it in terms of it's a quick test that can give you an estimate of soil organic matter, well, that might be more relatable, right? And so we need more outreach to help educate producers and extension folks on this kind of stuff. But more importantly, we need to put it into terms that, like, I think a lot of people in here, who in here is concerned about, you know, ecosystem benefits and a healthy community and all that stuff? I think most of us, right? I was at a conference in Ohio it was this year in March, and this was a group of farmers that they were big corn, soybean farmers, and I'm not saying what they're doing is bad, but they don't think about this kind of stuff the same way. What they think about is the bottom line. And every farmer thinks about the bottom line. Even if you are concerned about your impact on the environment, if you're farming and making money, it's not sustainable. So my friend Rafiq Islam, he's up at Ohio State, and he worked with Jim Horman, and they did a little study, and they found, and now this is going to change everywhere you are, right? So Ohio is Ohio, and the soils in Ohio are different than the soils in Kentucky, which are different than the soils in New York State, which are different from the soils in Vermont, right? Everywhere it's going to be a little different. But in Ohio, they found that for every 1% of organic matter that you build, it was worth $680 an acre in inputs. Nutrient inputs. That's coming from natural nutrient cycling. You're offsetting those nutrient inputs that you would buy in the form of fertilizer. And this isn't necessarily organic farmers doing this. This is, you know, big corn, soybean people. When we're talking about organic nutrients, we're talking about here not certified organic. We're talking about the organic nutrients that's coming from that soil organic matter that releases nutrients naturally. So for every 1% you build, you're offsetting $680 of nutrient need per acre. And that, you know, there have not been too many other studies like this. We need more of this kind of stuff. I've had people from Alabama say that number's really high. There might be something to it, but that might be really high. We don't know if we can do that here. I don't know. We need more of that to maybe make the case. But if you can start generating that kind of information, well, that's something that everybody, whether you're a long-haired hippie or I'm going to go out there and plow the hell out of my field kind of guy, we all can relate to the fact that you need to make a living, right? And more importantly, we need value. Like, we need to understand what the financial value is. I'm working on these projects that are incentivizing farmers to put carbon in the soil, but we really haven't sorted out these carbon markets. This is the hot stuff right now. We're talking about carbon markets and how offsetting industrial pollution might be possible if the industrial people pay the farmers for some kind of a carbon credit for the good stuff that they're doing. But that market isn't figured out yet. We need to figure that out. I've got a guy coming in March, on March 22nd, Mike Estat, and actually my friend Rafiq Islam is coming down. I'm 99% sure they're both coming. I haven't got a confirmation email from Estat yet. I'm going to have to bug him. But it depends. But he's a carbon market guy, and he's going to come down and talk about, you know, some of this stuff. And it's not just these grants, right? There are corporations now that are thinking about incentivizing farmers Because if you're a corporation now and you're doing climate smart stuff, well, that looks good to a lot of consumers. And so that's smart marketing, right? And so if you're able to say that we're working with farmers and they're quantifying this, but what is that value of carbon? What is that financial value? There needs to be more information on that. And like I said, Ohio might be different than Kentucky and New York and Maine, and everywhere is a little bit different. And so it's not as simple as just saying, well, carbon's worth $680 an acre. Well, different places it's going to be worth different dollar amounts, perhaps. We need better ways to track this carbon. This is me in the field again using that permanganate test. It's not accessible to people that don't have access to a handheld spectrophotometer, and those things aren't cheap. So we need more practical assessment methodology. I know Cornell has a solid soil health lab, and they've got a suite of tests, but you said they're not sending the kits out anymore, right?
Not doing the kits, they're doing, you have to send it in, it takes 6 to 8 weeks.
Yeah.
All that NRCS.
And so,
Around the country.
I think the long-term goal is we want to develop stuff that farmers can use on site, and it's relatable to them. I got ideas on this, and I'm trying to work with a student to maybe make this permanganate test a little more accessible. And we're going to try and see what we could do next semester on that with my undergraduate student projects. I mentioned carbon markets. We don't know what that's like. Compensation for producers in carbon markets, it's all got to be figured out. But it's coming to a head, right? I mean, the more and more we sit around and listen to NPR in our cars, the more and more we hear about the impacts of climate change. And this stuff's real, and it's coming to a head, and it's getting to the point now where the military's making adjustments for the climate, and we know that farmers are adapting to things that they're seeing in their fields. Right now, those guys that are up in Ohio that I was with last March, they were talking about, well, right now we got a longer growing season. It's great. And then somebody brought up, well, in 10 years, you're going to have the climate that they have in Arkansas. So how's that going to work for you? Cindy, you have a question?
Okay, your 1% song, that's a snapshot. Is there any time series or any longitude studies on that?
Well, that 1% organic matter is going to be relatively stable because that is soil organic matter measured. If I send my soil sample to University of Kentucky, unless I've added a whole bunch of cow manure to it, or unless I've done a whole lot of tillage, it's not going to change too much over the course of a year.
But without educating the farmers, if they, well, okay, I've got good now, I'm going to throw corn in there, raise corn, they have to be educated after they do something like this to make sure they keep adding to it rather than.
What you bring up is a good point, because for every soil, what constitutes it, you want me to cut it off? Am I talking too long?
No,
Wrap it up?
no, it's good.
All right. Wrap it up. Okay. Every soil is going to have different soil carbon content. And this is my last slide. So I think I've wrapped it up. But,
Well, then I'll go to Ohio, which is off the subject a little bit.
yeah.
I'm from northwestern Ohio, and that's where the black swamp was. So it's probably also depends on where you are in Ohio.
Yeah.
Up there, that black soil is, my family farms up there is very fertile.
Super fertile.
So adding this 1% might make a big, huge difference there because of the soil composition originally.
Yeah.
Where if you go to southern Ohio, where you're in this rock, whatever, you might not get this, probably will not get the same results.
Yeah, you're getting into stuff that like you're getting into like the 10,000 foot thinking now, where like if you have a soil that was inherently a good soil a long time ago, but it's been mismanaged for a while, you could punch a lot more carbon back into that soil than you could in a sandy soil, on the eastern shore of Maryland, where your maximum organic matter content is going to be probably 0.5%, 1%, which goes back to Cindy's question. Every soil is going to be different. What's good amount of organic matter in the soil is going to depend on the specific soil. I got resources, NRCS, they've got a great set of resources. If you're interested in this stuff, you can learn more. That link is a bad link. There's a soil quality testing kit there. Don't follow that link, but I can get you there. NRCS has their own soil quality testing kit. And, you know, here in Kentucky, you can call me, and I'm happy to talk soil health with you, or organic, or industrial hemp, or organic transition, or climate smart, or barriers to minority participation in organic. I cover all that. And there's a lot of relationships between all of it. And there's also UK Extension. We are all one extension. So there are certainly qualified folks within Extension at University of Kentucky that can cover this stuff too.